Hello everyone and welcome back. In case you don't know, I'm in the process of turning this cargo trailer into a hand tool focused woodworking shop. At the moment, it looks nothing like a workshop. Frankly, it just looks like a cargo trailer with a bunch of tools stacked in the corner. But all of that is about to change because in this video, I am building a workbench. This bench, actually. It's made of nothing but construction grade 2x4s and is strong enough to take a serious pounding. And because I like doing things the hard way, I'm building it using nothing but hand tools. In this video, I'm going to show you how I built it and all the mistakes I made along the way. Let's get started. The first step was procuring a bunch of lumber. These are all Douglas fir 2x4 studs that I purchased from a big box home improvement store. I chose Douglas fir for its relatively high density, and I selected the straightest and least damaged boards I could find. I bought several extras just in case. After they sat in my shop for a week or so, I went through the stack and selected the flattest ones to use in the top of the bench. Then I used a spoke shave to determine which direction these boards liked to be planed. I then made sure that all the boards would happily plane in the same direction once they were glued together. This made flattening the top by hand at the end of the project much easier. I also tried to alternate growth ring directions to make the top more stable. Then I marked the top pieces and sawed them to length. Then I began on the long and difficult process of hand planing both faces of each of the boards for the top. I did all of this work with a number 5 jack plane, and while that was a decent choice, because it was the only plane I had at the time, it didn't provide the best results for these very long surfaces. It will become more obvious later in the video, but these boards are still far from flat. To make matters worse, for the first day or so of this, my plane iron wasn't very sharp, which made pushing it very physically demanding. This is a great example of what planing a board should not look like. I'm struggling a lot. After carefully honing and polishing the iron, this is a great example of what planing a board should look like. Kinda easy. I can't believe I worked so hard with that dull plane. After planing all the top boards, I arranged them on the floor. I then created cutouts where each of the legs would insert into the top. This strategy actually came back to bite me pretty hard, so stay tuned to find out how I fix that mess. The legs will each be made of 2 laminated 2x4s with one cut longer than the other. The long one will serve as the tenon that goes through the top, and the short one will support the weight of the top. With all the legs cut, I marked out where the mortises would go for the long axis stretchers. I took another opportunity here to make lazy mortises by cutting really wide dados in each half of the leg instead of hand cutting the through mortises after the legs were glued together. These worked much better than the mortises in the top. Then it was time to start the glue up. I fully intended to do this entire build inside my trailer, but because it was January in St. Louis and PVA wood glue doesn't work under 55 degrees Fahrenheit, I borrowed a space in a climate-controlled workshop. I laid down a tarp to protect the floor from glue, then moved in my pieces. Then I started gluing up the legs. I wanted to do them first because they were less complicated than the top, and they would make good practice. I applied glue generously to both sides and spread it out. I don't know why I thought using my entire hand for this would be a good idea. I quickly switched to using a cheap foam brush instead. I decided to glue up the top in several stages because I didn't really have a good strategy for keeping 20 2x4s lined up while gluing, and I couldn't fathom working fast enough to not ruin it. First, I glued up the edges of the top. This allowed me to make sure that the mortises were sized accurately using that spacer block. I also glued together a couple of groups from the center of the top. Then I glued those pieces into 2 halves. Then it was time to glue those 2 halves together. I had noticed already that each of my halves was not flat. They were forming a curve, and I suspected that this was from uneven clamping pressure. So, for the final mating of the halves, I got smarter and decided to clamp it from both the top and the bottom. This was a lost cause. The damage had been done. From this point on, I had to deal with a curved top bench. Time for leg tenons. For each leg, I measured the mortise on the top and marked the leg where the shoulders and the cheeks needed to be cut. Then I did some sawing. I then tried to fit it into the mortise and made adjustments as needed to the mortise and the tenon until eventually it popped into place. Then, with the legs in place, it became very obvious. The curve in the top had caused the mortises for the legs to be angled outward, a lot. This was a huge headache because if the legs weren't square, the stretchers that connect the legs wouldn't come together properly. I could come up with two solutions to this problem. One would be to taper one side of the tenons, and the other would be to taper one side of the mortises. I decided to alter the tenons so that there wouldn't be a large gap on the top of the bench. There would be an invisible gap inside the joint instead. This worked really well, but I should have shimmed that gap because these joints ended up allowing a lot more movement than I wanted. While I was ignoring that problem, I made the long stretchers. These were pretty simple. I cut a board to length, marked out the tenons, sawed them, and then cleaned everything up until it fit. Then I needed to cut the mortises for the short stretchers. These were my first attempts at hand cutting through mortises with a chisel. And let's just say, I learned a lot. I marked them out and set up a board to use as a guide. Then I started chopping. Somehow I didn't get any footage of me chopping out these mortises. But I did break my chisel handle and got a lot of footage of me trying to remove the sheared off pieces of handle from the socket so I could install a new handle and keep working. Let's watch that. After getting that fixed, I completed the mortises. Then it was time to dry fit all the pieces together. I started with the sides and then the long stretchers. Then I inverted that base onto the top. It was so exciting to see it become a real bench. After that, I took it all apart again to start drilling holes through my joints to draw bore them. I have another video where I go into depth on why I chose draw boring here and how it works, so you should definitely go check that out. Here's the Cliff's Notes version. I drilled a hole through the mortise with the tenon removed. Then I inserted the tenon and marked the center of the hole on the tenon. Then I removed the tenon and drilled a hole through the tenon approximately 1/16 of an inch farther from the end than the hole in the mortise. When the tenon was reinserted, I drove a tapered oak dowel through the holes, and that locked the joint together without the need for glue. At this point, there was good weather in the forecast and I was done working with glue, so I decided to relocate to my trailer for the remainder of the build. In my new digs, I drilled and drawbored the top onto the base. These were more difficult than the joints on the base because I couldn't refit them as many times to test hole placement. I measured instead and adjusted the holes with a rasp once they were in place. A local wildlife representative stopped to watch me for a while. And then I spent some time leveling the legs and adding a chamfer to make them more durable. Then I started flattening the top. As I said earlier, the top of this bench was curved considerably because of poor planing of the top members and bad clamping technique, so I needed to remove a lot of material from the sides to bring them down to the level of the middle. I did some work with the jack plane because it was light, but I did myself an enormous favor and purchased a jointer plane, which I used for the majority of this work. By running it diagonally across the bench, it did a great job of flattening down the high spots. I loved the weight of it too. Perhaps counterintuitively, because it was heavy, I didn't feel the need to press into it hardly at all, so it actually felt easier to use than the jack plane. To take a break from planing, I sawed the ends of the bench off to make flat, mostly square ends. I also chamfered all the corners of the top. Then I went back to planing. When the top was sufficiently flat, there were still tool marks from the jointer plane that I needed to get out. I don't own a smoothing plane, so I started out by using a card scraper. This was horribly inefficient, either because I sharpened it poorly or I was using it incorrectly. Ultimately, I finished the job with some good old idiot-proof 80 grit sandpaper. I also took a few minutes to sand off some of the pencil markings and lumberyard stamps from the base, but I didn't sweat it. It is a workbench after all. Once I was satisfied, I rubbed some boiled linseed oil into every surface to help protect it and make it look really nice. This bench is the first large hand tool only woodworking project I have undertaken, and sitting here touching the finished product, I feel a massive sense of accomplishment. No part of this bench is perfect. Some parts of it are outright bad. And yet I'm so proud of what it is and all that I learned to build it. And now I have a bit of experience and a few skills that I can put to use in future projects, and a darn nice surface to build them on. I feel like I've made a new friend, and I can't wait to see what adventures we're going to have together. If you enjoyed this video, please click the like button below. And if you want to come along on an adventure with me and my bench, please subscribe. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time.